On behalf of the staff members and professors of PISAI, I welcome you all for the first lecture of this new cycle inaugurated by PISAI, the Georgetown Lecture on Contemporary Islam. It's our joy and honor to have with us this evening not only Professor Father Tom Michel, but also Professor John Borelli, the special assistant to the president of Georgetown University, Dr. John Di Gioia, for interreligious initiatives. Professor Borelli has done an immense amount of work in the field of relations between Christians and the faithful of other religions, but not least of all, he is a great friend of PISAI. I will leave to him, therefore, the honor of introducing the lecture and this evening's speaker.
Thank you very much, Father Cotini, for this introduction. Yes, I've been very active in interreligious dialogue and relations, but only for 36 years, which pales in comparison to some of you who are here who have been working in this field for more years than that. And some days I feel like, have we only begun? Are we still giving the same talks we gave 36 years ago, trying to convince people of mutual understanding between Christians and Muslims? This importance for Christians to know Islam, to study Islam, and the importance of Muslims to study Christianity for the sake of mutuality. But it still is news to many people in this world today. I think it would be news to the President of the United States. Oh, I'm sorry, that was a cheap joke. Easy joke. I want to introduce very briefly Father Tom Michel. Father Michel was ordained a priest in the Archdiocese of St. Louis, Missouri. I didn't know him, but I was at St. Louis University. That's where I went to college and met my wife. And I met my wife 50 years ago. I graduated in 1968. Tom volunteered to be a missionary to Indonesia and fell in love with Indonesia. And his ticket for staying in the Muslim world was to become a Jesuit. St. Ignatius would be very happy with that, I think. And immediately after his formation, they said, now we wanted you to go back to the United States and study Islam at the University of Chicago. And his whole life story has been trying to get back to Asia, trying to get back to Indonesia, because with his great credentials and his knowledge of Arabic and his facility for learning languages, he moves into a neighborhood and he's having dinner in the homes in 3 days, learning the local dialect. Tom served here in Rome at the Secretariat for Non-Christians in those days, Pontifical Council for Interreligious Dialogue, for several years, 13 years, 1981 to 1994. It seemed like a long time to many of us because we could always rely on Tom Michel for giving us very helpful and reliable information. That is when I first met him in the early 1980s. After that, he did get to Asia to help out at the Federation of Asian Bishops' Conferences in the field of dialogue. But when the Jesuits made a firm commitment to interreligious dialogue as essential to their mission and service to the church, he was asked by Father General to come back to Rome and to serve as his secretary for interreligious dialogue. And then again, after that, Tom came to Georgetown University and has been working with us, particularly at our campus in Doha of our School of Foreign Service. And now this year, Tom is inaugurating this relationship, this lectureship on contemporary Islam that Georgetown University is partnering with the Pontifical Institute for Arabic and Islamic Studies in doing. I want to say to you, this is a very flexible sort of lectureship. We are very fortunate that Tom Michel has been able to come here for a full year to work with students, to teach classes, and to advise. That is a luxury. Perhaps in the future this will be something briefer, but we do want to be of help to PISAI as best we can in areas that PISAI needs attention and would like support. And so we are hopeful tonight, as we inaugurate the Georgetown Lecture on Contemporary Islam, that there is a future of cooperation that will continue with Georgetown University and PISAI. Tom's topic is A Christian Encounter with Said Nursi's Risale-i Nur. Tom Michel.
Thank you, John. And thank you all for coming this evening. Let me start out by saying that 8 years ago, I was living in Ankara, Turkey. I was acting as parish priest in the English-speaking parish of Ankara. And when invited, I would give classes on Christian theology in the various Muslim theological schools in Turkey. I believe that during those years, altogether, I taught in about 15 different universities in Turkey. Well, in the summer of 2009, I went to a village in central Anatolia called Barla, B-A-R-L-A, Barla, to make my annual retreat. Some Turkish friends had loaned me a small house in the village for my 8-day stay. And the villagers, who were all Muslim, they knew that I was a Catholic priest, and they knew that I was spending a week in their village, and they knew why, and that was to read the Bible and to pray. They were very welcoming. And most mornings I would open the front door and I'd find a basket of fresh vegetables or some fruit or some loaf of bread waiting for me, hanging on the doorknob. Now the village of Barla was in many ways like the other agricultural villages in Turkey, but it had a unique history. For 11 years, between 1924 and 1936, the village was the site of house arrest of the most influential Muslim thinker of Turkey in the 20th century. His name was Said Nursi, and his 6,000-page commentary on the Quran. Now, I want to remind my students, who complain about a 20-page paper. This is a 6,000, not 600, 6,000-page commentary on the Quran called the Risale-i Nur, or the Message of Light. This is still read and still studied daily with great devotion by millions of Muslims inside and outside of Turkey. Every year when I was in Turkey, friends would call up and they say, we're getting together to have a dars tomorrow evening. Can you come with us? And so I would go, and I'd get into, it was always with men. The women would have their dars and the men would have theirs. So sometimes there'd be 40 or 50 men, and we'd all be crowded into the living room of a house. And somebody would read a passage from the Risale-i Nur. And then they'd get somebody who's kind of like an expert on it, who spent a lot of time on it, and he'd give his few thoughts. And then we'd start to share it, and people would add their own things. And it was really very, very, very good. This is going on until today in almost all cities in Turkey and in many cities outside. By people who are still studying the writing of Said Nursi, the Risale-i Nur. Now, Nursi was not a quiet, professorial type thinker. He was an activist, and he was a lifelong thorn in the side of the government officials of the Turkish Republic. His long life spans much of the history of that country. He was born and had his schooling in the waning decades of the Ottoman Empire. And like many at that time, he was convinced that the old Ottoman order was breathing its last, and a new Turkish reality was about to supplant it. the shape that the new Turkish Republic would take, and particularly the educational reforms that would be necessary to meet the challenges posed by modernity, were the main concerns of Nursi's early years. Upon the Russian occupation of eastern Anatolia at the beginning of World War I, he commanded a cavalry unit to oppose the invaders and was captured by the Russians and spent the first months of the Russian Revolution in a prison camp in Russia. He escaped, made his way back to Turkey, where Ataturk was engaged in establishing the Republic of Turkey. Now, Nursi's early nationalist cooperation with Ataturk, it started out pretty well, but it soured as he concluded that the kind of nation that Ataturk envisioned was a slavish imitation of European ways and not compatible with Nursi's understanding of the teaching of the Quran. Now, all this time he was writing, and his works from that period introduce us to the world of plans and new hopes and conflicts and disappointments in the early years of the Turkish Republic. Eventually he gave up. He said, this is not the way change is going to come about. It's not going to come about by political change. He withdrew from politics and he retired to his Kurdish homeland. He's Kurdish. He was accused of involvement in a local rebellion and sent into exile in the small, isolated village of Barla, where 80 years later I made my retreat. Quran commentary that grew before his death to 6,000 pages. So Nursi defied the secularizing dress codes. He always dressed in a turban and in a long galabia type garment. And the language restrictions, in those days you were supposed to have the call to prayer in Turkish. He refused to do that. Barla was the only place that was still doing it in Arabic. And so he just wouldn't buckle down. He defied. He just kept on doing his own things, didn't make much of a fuss about it, but he did things the way he believed Islam taught people to do them. But for these reasons, he was viewed with much suspicion and even antagonism by the officials of the state. He was imprisoned over and over in various towns in Turkey, and more than once his life was threatened by enemies. And now in his final years, when he had become an old man, Nursi felt exonerated in his hopes for a new Turkey by the election of Adnan Menderes. Now, when Nursi died in 1960, he was buried at the birthplace of Abraham in Urfa. But the drama surrounding his life still was not over. Shortly after the military coup overthrew and executed Nursi's hero, Menderes, unknown persons dug up his body and hid it in some still unknown place. We still don't know where he's buried. Well, I first became acquainted with the writings of Sayyid Nursi through his students. I was teaching at Ankara University in 1986, and some students asked if I had ever read anything by Sayyid Nursi. I said I had not. They gave me some small pamphlets containing the few portions of the Risale-i that had been translated into English. It still is not all translated into English. It's all translated into Arabic, if you want to read 6,000 pages of Arabic. But it is not all translated, about maybe 4,500 pages translated into English. But in those days, 1986, they were just small little pamphlets and passages. And so they had a study group, and at their invitation, I joined the study group, and we would read and discuss together the message of light. And in this way, I came acquainted with the Risale-i Nur. Well, I can't hope to boil all of these many pages down of Nursi's reflections on the Quran in the light of modern times in one short talk, but I will mention 5 areas where I find his writings intellectually and spiritually stimulating. The first is Nursi's analysis of modern civilization, which he sees as essentially ambivalent. The benefits for humankind provided by advances in modern technology and efficient social systems are undeniable. And religious believers should avoid misplaced nostalgia for pre-modern life and times. This is what was going on in Nursi's time, that the religious people were saying no to all of this. He said, wait a minute, a lot of this is good. And with the aspects of modernity that promote human welfare, Nursi has no quarrel. The problem, according to Nursi, arises from the fact that modern civilization has clouded people's minds so that they're unable to see the value of the spirit. Modern life focuses on the immediate, on the temporal, the ephemeral, and finds it difficult to see beyond this to questions of eternal significance. Instead of seeking the truly good life intended by God for people, modern men and women are caught up in a rat race of seeking wealth and prestige and pleasure and power in the mistaken fantasy that these things will bring them happiness. The psychological toll of modernity, he says, is high, and people can become frozen into inactivity. Modern man, he holds, is unable to evaluate seriously questions of eternal weight. One's mind becomes dulled to reality, and the person becomes unable to take serious decisions and exert his creativity in a positive direction. Thus, unless one is constantly renewed by the vitality that only religious faith can provide, the modern person is liable to stagnate, and the natural impulse to holistic well-being, spiritual, psychological, and physical, will atrophy. Thus, according to Nursi, people need a faith life not simply as a preparation for eternity, but to attain the fullness of life that they are called to here on earth. Modernity, he says, is not the enemy of faith, but a patient in need of the spiritual medicine that faith provides. The next theme of the Risale-i Nur that I want to speak about responds to some of the questions that initially attracted me to learn more about Nursi's thought. As a committed Christian, I wanted to know whether Nursi had anything to say to Christians or others who do not follow the religion of Islam. I wanted to see how Nursi regarded Christians and whether he felt that there was any hope for mutual understanding and respect between the followers of the two religions. I wanted to know if there are any points of convergence or agreement between the views expressed in the Risale-i Nur and my own deeply held convictions. So these are questions that today we might sum up under the heading of something like Nursi's views on Muslim-Christian dialogue. But what I discovered in reading the Risale-i Nur was that the notion of Muslim-Christian dialogue was too timid a concept to comprehend Nursi's daring vision. He never uses the word dialogue, which implies that what Muslims and Christians ought to be doing is talking to each other. Instead, he speaks boldly of Muslims being united with, or coming into unity with, true Christians. This must have been a shocking concept when Sayyid Nursi first enunciated it over a century ago. The first time I see him talking about this was in 1911, so 106 years ago. However, he never wavered in this view, and down through the years, Nursi continued to call for a cessation of hostilities and theological disputes between Muslims and Christians, so that the two communities might together make a much needed joint contribution to the spiritual needs of our world. The kind of unity of action that Nursi envisions brings me to my third point. Writing for his fellow Muslim believers, Nursi asks, where are the enemies against which Muslims should be exerting their efforts? It is not, he answers, against this or that group of people or nation, but the enemies of Muslims are three: ignorance, poverty, and disunity. Ignorance, poverty, and disunity. These enemies, he says, which must be opposed by all those, Muslims and others, who are seriously committed to submitting their lives to God's will. And Nursi cites a sound hadith from Muhammad that calls upon Muslims to cooperate with Christians in the struggle to advance the cause of faith in the world. He says, now I'm going to quote him. He says, it is recorded in authentic traditions of the Prophet that at the end of time, the truly pious among the Christians will unite with the people of the Quran and fight their common foe, anti-religious forces. And in our day also, Muslims need to unite sincerely, not only with their own brothers and fellow believers, but also with the truly pious and spiritual among the Christians, temporarily refraining from debating points of difference in order to combat their joint enemy, aggressive atheism. So he looks forward to a world in which sincere Muslims and Christians work together to overcome ignorance, to eliminate poverty, and to reconcile groups who are torn asunder by conflict and disunity. And in doing so, they bear witness to the world at large that this is the way God wants people to live. Well, you can imagine how excited I was when I first read such views of Sayyid Nursi, which he wrote, interestingly enough, many decades before the Second Vatican Council called upon Muslims and Christians to work together to build peace, to establish social justice, to defend moral values, and to strive for human liberty. Another aspect of Nursi's thought that I find relevant for our lives today is his attitude towards violence and war. For in any nation, all citizens are expected to support whatever wars are declared and carried out by their governments. And anyone opposing a national war is accused of being disloyal. As Nursi realistically notes, ruling parties and elites frequently foment conflict and war in an attempt to increase their popularity and rally support for an unpopular or incompetent government. Just as arms manufacturers and traders favor war for reasons of profit. Now he was often criticized and challenged because of this commitment to peace. Critics claim that armed resistance against European incursions, they provided an opportunity to revive Islamic zeal and assert the moral strength of the nation. They charged Nursi, who proposed prayers for peace and negotiated settlement, as indirectly supporting the invaders' aims. Now, in response, Nursi rejected the practice of opposing force with force, asserting that he wanted release from the attacks of aggressors, but not by using the same methods that the attackers were employing. Religion, he says, teaches people to seek truth and uprightness, not to try to achieve their aims by force. In consequence, he advised his students that they could better use their time studying the Quran than by engaging in military service. Well, you can imagine how popular that was. Later in life, he was asked whether freely relinquishing one's rights for the sake of peace should not be considered a form of compromise with wrongdoing. And reflecting on his many years in prison and his experiences there, he said, a person who is in the right, and he was always convinced he was in the right, a person who is in the right is fair. He will sacrifice his penny's worth of rights for the general peace, which is worth 100 times that. So this is the conclusion he came to by near the end of his life. So he makes clear that his silence must not be interpreted as an agreement with all the decisions made by public authorities. He's going to be silent. But it should be understood rather in terms of passive resistance. He states, I support neither intellectually nor on scholarly grounds the unjust and arbitrary commands of a ruler, and I do not act in accordance with them. Although for 20 years I've been severely oppressed during my torturous captivity, I have not become involved in politics, nor provoked the authorities, nor disturbed public order. Along with Gandhi and Martin Luther King, Sayyid Nursi must be seen as one of the 20th century's great exponents of nonviolent resistance. And with Muslim contemporaries like Abdul Ghaffar Khan and Abul Kalam Azad, he makes a strong case for a truly Islamic nonviolent activism to bring about social change. The final topic I want to take up of Nursi's thought concerns pardon and reconciliation. He notes that one who does wrong to another might derive a momentary satisfaction by having taken revenge, but he pays for it with a sense of guilt and fear of retaliation. The result is fear, anger, and anxiety. There's only one solution for this, states Nursi, and that is reconciliation, which the Quran commands, and which truth, reality, human welfare, and Islam require and encourage. He notes that Islam commands, and again I'm quoting him, that a believer should not be vexed with another for more than 3 days, and that so long as there is no reconciliation, both sides suffer the torments of fear and revenge. And his conclusion is that it is essential in human affairs to make peace quickly. Often a person's unwillingness to forgive arises, says Nursi, from a lack of self-knowledge. a resistance to finding in oneself many of the same qualities that one condemns in another. If someone is unwilling to confront the defects in one's own attitudes and actions, it's easy to demonize the other and regard them as an enemy. Nursi's advice is to look at the defect in your own soul that you do not wish to see, he says. If you respond with forgiveness and pardon and magnanimity, in such a way as to conquer your enemy swiftly, then you will have escaped all sin and harm. Self-awareness, he says, should lead to repentance. Repentance to forgiveness, forgiveness to reconciliation, thus laying the ground, the seeds for eternal, for a lasting peace. But so long as no reconciliation takes place, the wounds to human relations fester and grow and turn into resentment. Discord produces more discord. Violence engenders even greater violence. And the state of conflict is perpetuated. The only way out of this spiraling succession of violent reactions and counter-reactions is for one party to take the initiative to reconcile. Reconciliation heals what force can never heal: the suspicion and resentment caused by someone doing wrong to another. Now, Nursi sees a relationship between God's abundant forgiveness of human faults and the need for believers to forgive one another. Just as God is generous in forgiving anyone who repents, so St. Nursi encourages his students to imitate these divine qualities by acting with love and forgiveness toward those who wronged them. And here I'll quote him again: "Your sincerity, loyalty, and steadfastness are sufficient reasons to disregard one another's faults. And at the last judgment, divine justice will see your good deeds, see that your good deeds predominate, and that you have acted with love and forgiveness, and God will forgive you." So he says, one must even forgive one's enemies and those who have done them wrong. Sayyid Nursi repeatedly expressed his forgiveness for his prison wardens, judges, government officials, law officers, civil authorities who treated him unjustly during the period of his courtroom trials and subsequent imprisonments. His point in forgiving others is that the relationship of enmity created by the wrong done by one person to another can only be overcome and superseded by forgiveness. Otherwise, one becomes a prisoner of circumstances, events, and the deeds of others, and history becomes a string of injustices and retaliations. This chain of evil and violence can be broken, he notes, by one who is willing to take the initiative to forgive. Finally, I might mention that according to Nursi, efforts at forgiveness and peacemaking should not be limited only to fellow Muslims. He argues that members of the people of the book, Jews and Christians, if they want to make peace, their offers of peace should be welcomed. Well, I wish that time permitted me to go into the many enlightening and challenging ideas that go to make up the thought of Sayyid Nursi. The Risale-i Nur is kind of like a mosaic. Its pages made up of separate treatises that fit together in a comprehensive understanding of God's message for humankind. Some of his writings take up themes of spirituality. For example, that of ikhlas, the importance of doing any deed, no matter how humble or insignificant, for the sole purpose of pleasing God. Elsewhere, he discusses philosophical topics, such as the nature of human responsibility for one's acts, and he explores the mystery of God's justice in relation to natural disasters. He has much to say on the question of social ethics and is sharply critical of the actual weaknesses and problems that he perceived in Muslim societies. He's very self-critical. He develops a viable theology of hope and advances strong arguments for the resurrection of the dead and life in eternal life. He has written special treatises for children, for the sick, for the elderly. I like that one especially. and in a work he calls The Supreme Sign, he invites his readers to enter upon a contemplation of discovering the loving presence of God in all the events and aspects of nature. It's a beautiful, beautiful piece. In my studies of the Risale-i Nur, I found myself gaining many new insights that enriched my faith life as a committed Christian. Some insights were striking reflections of what I have known and practiced from the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius and from others among Christianity's great spiritual writers. There's a universal aspect to true wisdom, whatever its origin, and by whomever it is expressed. There's not a Muslim wisdom intended exclusively for Muslims, and a Christian wisdom of value only for Christians. It is the one and same God who generously uses holy and insightful persons to guide and inspire us all. When a man like Sayyid Nursi devotes so many years of his life, from the activism and idealism of his youth, through the imprisonment and persecution of his middle years, to the pains and illnesses of old age, to the reading and study and prayerful contemplation of his sacred book, he has much to offer us all. He becomes an instrument by which God implants divine guidance in the hearts of men and women. Well, looking around our group today, I see that there are a number of young scholars who are in various stages of scholarship. And I think I would be remiss in my responsibilities if I were to fail to point out some of the fruitful areas of further scholarship and possible thesis topics connected with the thought of Sayyid Nursi. For example, there's Sayyid Nursi's relationship to the Sufi tradition. He always distinguished himself from the Sufis. He would say, well, the Sufis say this, and I say this. He would always distinguish himself. And even while he was doing this, he professed great respect for their views. And he's been characterized later on by scholars, such as my own professor, Fazl Rahman, who called him a neo-Sufi. Well, what does that mean? It's a neologism, so we have to give it meaning. Well, we're waiting for one of you in the audience to write your thesis on that. What does it mean to be a neo-Sufi? For one thing, he never had a pir, which you're supposed to have as a Sufi. And he never joined a tariqah, he never joined a Sufi order. So, which many Sufi teachers would say you can't do, but he didn't. So there's a thesis for you to explore. It'd be a useful exercise to go through his writings and try to delineate exactly where he stands in relationship to tasawwuf. Another avenue would be to seek his influences, especially that of great Indian thinkers, Shah Waliullah and Ahmad Sirhindi. He has a lot of respect for both of these, and a man that we don't really know that much about, but was very influential on so many thinkers in modern Turkey, Khalid al-Baghdadi. He was Naqshbandi, and he was living in Baghdad, and you always hear everybody referring to him, but we don't have many of his own writings. They're probably in some mosque library somewhere, and we haven't found them yet, but that's somebody to study. Scholars interested in spirituality and nature mysticism can find fertile territory to explore Nursi's writings on the value and practice of tefekkür, or meditation on the mysteries of nature, coming to God through what Nursi called the book of creation. He would wax eloquent on, and to him it was a sign of, it was like a parable, you might say, of the resurrection of the body, how the dead earth, Anatolia has a really cold, gray winter, which makes the Anatolian spring even more magical, when all these flowers come out and all the trees with their blossoms and all that. And in so many parts of the Risale-i, he's just using that as the basis for his meditation, and it's just beautiful, beautiful passages. Scholars interested in interreligious themes can find much to occupy them in comparing, for example, Nursi's approach to peace building with Pope John Paul's, remember his twin pillars of justice and forgiveness. You have to have them both, according to Pope John Paul. Justice without forgiveness is not going to do it. You're going to be resentful, you're going to be angry. Forgiveness without justice, also not going to do it. You need them both. I'd like to see somebody studying, say, Nursi's approach to peace in that context. I think it would be a very fruitful kind of thing. Well, as a Jesuit, I found fruitful grounds for reflection in Nursi's approach to ikhlas, sincerity, or purity of intention, with St. Ignatius's approach on doing everything solely for God's greater glory. It comes down to very much the same kind of thing. Now, some of Nursi's views are unique. I haven't found anything in the Christian tradition immediately comparable, for example, to his treatise for the sick or his epistle for the elderly. So there's a lot of richness in the Risale-i and much scope for research. I thank God that I have personally been able to learn much from Sayyid Nursi's writings. And it's my hope that Muslims and Christians and others might also find benefit in the wisdom contained in the Risale-i.